Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another live stream here at Sergeant Tank. So tonight we're going to be talking about starting up your very first freshwater aquarium. It's something that I've covered in the past. However, I figured I want to start going through and doing some live streams, kind of touching on some of those older videos that we did here on the channel. As I get emails, questions, and stuff through the internet, through different forums, I'm oftentimes asked what type of livestock, how do I go about starting up a system. I would say the very first thing that anybody new getting into the hobby, we could probably all vouch to this, is what type of livestock do we get? What size aquarium do we get? You know, we go into a local fish store, we go into our pet store, maybe a big box store. Wherever it may be. It might be at a family member's house, a friend's, could be at a local office of some sort, some business. And, you know, there's many different avenues in which get us kind of wanting to get a system of our own. Is what appealed to me, of course, is going to be a different than what appeals to one of you guys. And I know that's the magic question that we're all asked, is what fish will go with what. You know, this is my size aquarium. You know, we always hear all of these different things. And I know sometimes it can be discouraging for the new aquarists that's coming into the hobby, and they see this beautiful fish that they want to keep, you know, maybe at a local fish store, and they don't really know how to go about setting up an aquarium for that fish. My first recommendation is find out what your water source, water chemistry is. And if you're in close proximity to that location for which you would be acquiring these fish, or could be inverts, shrimp, that type of thing, is most likely you're going to be on a similar water source, but that's not always the case. So let's pause there for a moment. If you go into a big box store, and I don't want to bash on any specific big box stores, but I think you guys can read between the lines and know what I'm talking about, is oftentimes you see little tags up by the tank that show care requirements. It shows, you know, what can coexist with one another. It shows the temperature, the size. Oftentimes, a lot of that stuff is really vague, and it's not very consistent based on the reality of what that actual species is. And sometimes they're misclassified too. That's kind of a whole nother conversation later on that we can discuss in a different live stream. So now going back to, you see that beautiful fish, where do you start? And again, that water chemistry to me would be one of the first recommendations I have, is figure out what water chemistry it is. And then that will really start narrowing down your options, because if you're on a well system, maybe you're on a different type of municipal water source, maybe your local fish store is 3 hours away. I mean, that happens. Maybe you're ordering in fish. So there is some variables there to think about, is figure out the water chemistry. And you may be asking yourself, well, Jeremy, how do I go about figuring out the water chemistry? I have no idea. Where do I start? That's where you would bring in a sample. Bring in a sample. Maybe you can find somebody at your local fish store that could go ahead and do a sample and give you the basics at that point to identify what your water source is. Maybe it's obtaining a report through your, if you're on a city water source, maybe it's obtaining a water treatment report through them. That could get you kind of pointed in the right direction. Maybe bring in that report, talk with somebody at your local fish store, somebody who is knowledgeable, somebody who will give you the time. Because if these are pets, you know, any local fish store that you go into, maybe I wouldn't go in there on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, even on a Sunday. Maybe go in there when it's not so busy, you know, kind of respect that. Go in there, set aside a time, maybe go in there beforehand and be like, or give them a call and talk with the owner or the manager or somebody, say, hey, can we set up a time? Can I have 10, 15 minutes of your time? I want to come in. I want you to kind of explain to me what my water chemistry is. And then from there, you can really start focusing on, maybe it's community fish, maybe it's different cichlids, maybe it's some bottom-dwelling fish, maybe it's some oddball fish. Maybe there's something in specific that at that point, then you can kind of narrow it down and start taking a look at. And then from there, my first recommendation is, once you have, let's say, 10 or 15 different species that you've kind of narrowed it down to from 500, Now you've really narrowed down that list, so you can kind of fine tune it to what's appropriate based on your water chemistry. Because of course, the health, right, of our pet, of our fish or whatever we're keeping, ultimately is the most important thing of all. It doesn't matter what pets we're keeping. And then from that point, we can go ahead and then start focusing on what size tank is the most appropriate. So what is in your financial means, as well as what is in your means based on your physical location. So maybe you're in an apartment. Maybe you're in a certain dwelling to where the weight capacity will far exceed the structural integrity of whatever it is that you're trying to set up in that location. So identify where you live to make sure, first and foremost, a lot of us have started out in an apartment, myself included. You are limited based on somebody that may have a basement or something like that, right? I mean, we're limited in options. And then from that point, you can go ahead and, let's say you only have the financial means to, and structural integrity, everything else that goes along with it, to go ahead and, let's say you're going to do a 40 breeder. So now you've narrowed down your option. This is my max size. So with all of this information now you can then go into your local fish store. Again, talk with somebody who's going to take the time and give you that attention that you deserve. And be honest with them. Let them know that you're completely green, that you have no idea. You don't understand any of this. Have them break it down to you completely. And at least if you have some information that you can present to that worker, to that location, to whatever person it is that may help you out to get your feet up and running, to get your system up and running, is going to help them out much more, not only for them, but also for you, and even more so for your fish. So we have a 40 breeder. So now you've narrowed it down from 500 to 15 to now, let's say, 5 species. Because every local fish store, every source is going to be different, a lot of which type of livestock they're going to carry. And it kind of depends on your area. It depends on your location. It depends on the water source there. You know, a lot of these factors really you have to think about. And of course, do your research. Understand the fish, understand the species that you plan on getting to, you know, and you can be doing all of your own research in the midst of all of this. So really take the time and dive into and really understand the importance of what it is to keep those fish in that situation in a 40 breeder. So you can see what I'm saying. It can get very overwhelming if you go into a local fish store and you have 500 different species that you could possibly pick from. And now you've narrowed it down from 500 to, let's say, 5. Rather than going into your local fish store, and we've all been guilty of this, myself included, is you end up picking out that most beautiful fish. Maybe it's a little bit too much for your financial liking, but you still suck it up and you end up taking it home. You may keep the thing alive for maybe a week, could be a couple of weeks, and then you realize the care requirements that really go into that fish as you start now doing the research. So, of course, do the research beforehand. It's kind of like that carpenter rule of measure twice, cut once. And that kind of applies in the aspect of this hobby, is understand what species of fish you're going to get, put them before your own visual satisfaction. And again, I hope that that can kind of somewhat make sense. So anybody new, maybe somebody that's not certain, somebody that's watching this later on, is to help now kind of narrow it down to what's the most important for that livestock. So now you've established you have 5 species that you can pick from. And these are all hypothetical. I'm not saying you wouldn't have more than 5, because of course you would. But I hope that you guys can understand where I'm coming from. So you have now 5 species, hypothetically, in this situation, that you can now possibly introduce or have the options to pick from to introduce into a 40 breeder. But before you do any of that, this is one of the most important factors to think about. Because, I'm going to kind of fast forward, then we'll come back to this in just a moment, is understand cycling an aquarium. I think it's one of the biggest things that every one of us starting out into the hobby failed miserably at, is not understanding what's called the nitrogen cycle. And oftentimes this is discussed, usually in grade school. However, as most of us, as we get age and get older, you don't remember all that stuff. And without me going through all of the technical aspects of it, just Google cycling aquarium, and probably one of the first search options that may pop up is talking about the nitrogen cycle. And basically what that does is that is providing the appropriate amount of bacteria biologically to maintain a balanced ecosystem. So understand how to cycle an aquarium. And I've talked about this before. And very briefly, I want to discuss the importance of cycling an aquarium. There is some options there for you guys. Now, the controversy, maybe yes and no as far as controversy. Maybe that's not the appropriate wording to use. Do you go fishless? Do you not? Do you add ammonia? Do you not? There's all of these factors, and I'm just going to tell you, for me personally, and a lot of us have been in the hobby long enough, understand that we keep other beneficial bacteria, quote unquote, seeded media. And that's just a fancy way of saying, most of you guys probably have seen a sponge filter at this point if you've done some research, maybe a hang-on back filter, canister filter, that type of thing. Is you're going to have some sort of, now if you're new, you're not going to necessarily have this on hand. So how do you go about getting, and that could be at this point, Jeremy, well, how do I go about getting seeded media? All of the stuff's fine and dandy, but how do I go about doing it? So you do have some options there. Is you could possibly go to your local fish store, and they could very well possibly give you, and you don't know unless you ask. It just depends on the relationship, and kind of it depends on the local fish store. Is you could do a couple of different things. You could ask them, as most of them probably run sponge filters. You could simply ask, hey, do you have any extra seeded sponge filters? And of course, they're going to know what you mean by seeded. Do you have any extra sponge filters on hand that I could purchase from you? And they could simply say no. And then what I would ask is, if they don't, well, would you be willing to take out one of your sponges and wring it out into a fish bag with some water for me? Well, sure, no problem. What you would do is simply take that home before you've introduced any fish. So you're doing your research, because the cycling doesn't matter. You need to cycle your aquarium regardless of what fish you end up keeping in it. That's the most important balance. It's the heart of the system. Now you go back to your house, and this is the only one time I would ever recommend introducing any form of somebody else's media or dirty aquarium water into your system when you have no other options. Is you would simply dump that into your system. Is, you would go through, understand at this point, there is some steps that I understand we've skipped. However, at this point, between the conversations that you would be having with your local fish store or whoever's helping you get your system up and running, you're going to understand at this point in the game of how to add water, the chlorinating. Those are basic things that they're going to go through with you. And now you'll go home, end up dumping that aquarium water basically into your system. And now you could be asking, Jeremy, well, how do I know when it's ready for fish? That's the magic question. Is it takes time. Could take 5 days, could take a week, could take a month. And this is basically if you go completely fishless cycle. And you can add fish in order to develop certain amounts of ammonia to turn that into certain nitrifying bacteria and so forth. And a lot of this stuff really can get quite complex. But again, that's why I can't put emphasis on enough is look into research on the nitrogen cycle. It will explain it, how things are broken down. Is you get yourself a test kit. So we've now gotten through these steps, and now you want to test the water before we potentially start adding in a lot of livestock or whatever, form of livestock we might end up adding into that system. Is the one I recommend is the API, or I'm sorry, the Tetra 6-in-1 test strips or the API liquid test kit. However, if you're new, keep it simple. You have one aquarium. It's fine. Get yourself the Tetra 6-in-1 test strips. Not a big deal. If you're running a lot of aquariums, as somebody who's been in the hobby for a lot of years like myself, then maybe the API liquid test kit might be a better decision financially. Kind of depends. So without me going through and breaking down what you're checking for, this again is where you guys need to do your research and you need to talk to somebody. Myself as a content creator here on YouTube, any one of us, it's really hard to paint a clear picture without being there in person and explaining things on a visual, from a visual standpoint. But what I can tell you is some very basic and simple numbers, and this is strictly a baseline, is your nitrate levels. So let's take that back. Your ammonia levels essentially should be at 0. Your nitrite should simply be at 0. And your nitrates, to me, for a lot of different reasons, which I can go through in a later live stream or video, is anywhere between 5 and 10 and 35 parts per million. And if you start maintaining constant 0 nitrates, I know in my experience, I've tested this, but again, people may have different viewpoints, and that's completely fine. But I have to tell you based on my experience, since I'm the one explaining this, is if you maintain a constant 0 nitrate level, you could be opening up a can of worms to causing some major fluctuations within your system. And now we're up to this point in the stage. So we've gone through those different stages. There's many different forms of substrates. That's always a question that's asked. Well, what is the appropriate substrate? So any of your standard gravel substrate, I'm not a huge fan of pinks and blues and greens and all of the fancy colors. I just personally enjoy black. It really makes a lot of fish pop and stand out. You can also look into plants. There's options there. However, without overcomplicating this live stream and this topic too much, I would focus on basic plants. Basic plants that will help maintain that cycle, that nitrogen cycle that we're talking about. You would want to go check and see, talk to your local fish store, talk to somebody who's going to give you the time first and foremost, and just simply ask them, again, based on your water chemistry, your temperature, those factors, give me some basic plants that help me get my system stabilized and up and running. Something with very low light, something simple, something low maintenance, something I'm not going to have to be trimming constantly. And there's many options out there for that. Again, you guys got to do the legwork and do your research. So take advantage of certain aspects of the internet as far as Google. Don't believe everything you hear, especially in a lot of Facebook groups, maybe even in other YouTube videos. Everybody has the answer to everything. That's one of the issues with the internet. And I'm sure at this point, anybody new can understand that, you always are going to get a mixed answer to everything. One thing I can promise you guys, can never guarantee it, but I can promise that I always do my best in order to provide the most concise and honest feedback in order for others to succeed in this hobby. How I got to where I'm at is by simply failing. I didn't do a lot of research. I didn't look up to many people as far as the hobby goes. And there is a lot of reputable people in the hobby to definitely look up to. But I didn't really have those at my availability for a lot of years. It was just really a lot through trial and error. And I hope at this point, some of that will kind of provide a little bit of insight to anybody maybe unsure if this is the right hobby for you. But I can tell you from being a family, having a wife and 4 children and many pets, and doing a lot of different rescue projects, not only from the standpoint of aquatic life, but also with mammals and other sort of pets, birds, what have you, not to discourage anybody. But out of all of the pets that we have owned through the years and what we currently have, fish keeping is by far one of the most tedious, and it can be one of the most challenging. So realize, research, and your effectiveness is how much of attentiveness you're going to give to that system. Enjoy your system. I can't put emphasis on this enough. Don't go from 1 tank to 25 in a year. Go from 1 tank to none in 2 years. Spend that first 2 years just enjoying your system. If I can be of any use and offer any insight, that is the most important thing that I would give to anybody. Spend a year and a half, 2 years simply enjoying the fish. And then from there, you'll know if it's right for you to pursue and start adding other tanks. Thank you so much for listening up to this point.